Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Since 1997, the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Denver, Colorado, the Most Reverend Charles J. Chaput grew up in Kansas, became a Franciscan in 1965, and was ordained to the priesthood in 1970. He holds degrees from St. Fidelis College, Catholic University, and Capuchin College. Archbishop Chaput is the author most recently of Render unto Caesar, Serving the Nation by Living Our Catholic Beliefs in Political Life. I have read it so far twice. Archbishop Chaput, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, when I have a guest who's mentioned in a front page article of the New York Times on the day of the taping, here we have an abortion issue again dividing Catholic votes, theological dispute felt in a swing city. The reporter David Kirkpatrick reports from Scranton, Pennsylvania. When I have a guest who's mentioned in a front page story in the New York Times, we start by talking about that article. Let me quote the Times article to you. Quote, "A struggle within the church over just how Catholic voters should think about abortion is once again flaring up just as political partisans prepare an all-out battle for the votes of mass-going Catholics. Bishops around the country scolded House Speaker Nancy Pelosi of California for publicly contradicting the church's teachings on abortion." Close quote. What did Speaker Pelosi say that warranted correction?
Well, she said that the church's teaching about abortion wasn't clear, that the present position of the church is one that became popular 50 years ago, I think she said. And,
yes.
And no one who knows the history of the church's understanding of abortion really would say anything like that. From the very earliest days, in the immediate post-apostolic writings of the Christian community, abortion was condemned. And it's been the constant teaching of the church through those centuries that abortion is always, in all circumstances, wrong.
All right. By the way, did you notice the use, you read the,
I read the
article on the airplane flying in from Denver today.
Right.
Did you notice the use of the word scolded? Bishops
Yes,
scolded
yes.
Speaker Pelosi. Did you scold her, Archbishop?
No, actually, I wrote an article, a letter to the people of the Archdiocese of Denver, making sure that they didn't misunderstand the issue from what she said. She spoke publicly on Meet the Press, and I thought it was important for us to say something so that people wouldn't be misled by what she said.
All right.
You know, scandal is a deep concern in the Christian community, and that means leading someone to stumble. And so when people who are Catholics say this is a Catholic position when it's not, it's absolutely essential for bishops.
She began, I believe I can quote her exactly, she began her answer to Tom Brokaw on Meet the Press by saying, quote, "as an ardent Catholic,"
That's
comma,
correct.
And then she misrepresented church teaching.
Yes.
That's all right.
Ardent means heartfelt. She may well be heartfelt, but she wasn't educated on this issue.
All right. The Times article also notes that the Bishop of Scranton has forbidden Senator Joseph Biden from receiving communion in Scranton, which is the senator's hometown. Senator Biden's position on abortion. I'm quoting Senator Biden. "I'm prepared as a matter of faith to accept that life begins at conception, but for me to impose that judgment on others is inappropriate in a pluralistic society," close quote. What's wrong with that position?
Well, we're always imposing opinions on people who don't necessarily agree with us. All law is an opinion being imposed on the broader community, whether it's seatbelt laws or laws about speed limits. We're always telling people what to do. So it seems like the nature of government is to develop laws that protect the safety of people. And abortion, protecting unborn children from being aborted, is a safety issue, and it seems the kind of appropriate kind of stance of government.
Well, here's what I'd like to ask you to address. Senator Biden seems to be, I won't even try to put words into his mouth. Here would be an argument that one hears over and over again.
Right.
The pro-life teaching of the Catholic Church is a distinctively Catholic teaching, and it should be binding upon Catholics in their private lives because the Catholic Church is, after all, a voluntary society. If you're a Catholic, you ought to be willing to abide by the rules of the Church. But it's Catholic. It doesn't have application to the wider society. Now, how do you respond to that?
We can respond even historically. 35 years ago, before Roe versus Wade, it was a common teaching of our country through its laws that abortion was an inappropriate and illegal act because it was seen as something that was harmful to people. So for people to say that, and this country was never a Catholic country, it's not today, it's a common belief of most cultures that abortion is the taking of innocent life.
So you're drawing an extremely sharp line there and saying it is your responsibility to speak out on behalf of the unborn, not purely as a Catholic bishop, archbishop, but as a concerned American on a question of human rights. This is not a specifically Catholic issue.
I would say it's not primarily a Catholic issue. I think the place where we stand on abortion is supported by our faith, but it's a human rights issue from the Church's perspective.
All right. Let me return to the Times article. Some Catholics in Scranton intend to vote for the pro-choice candidate in this presidential election, Senator Obama, explaining their position by, I'm quoting the Times article here, repeating liberal arguments about church doctrine broader than abortion. I think that one of the teachings of God is to take care of the less fortunate, the Times quotes a Scranton Catholic as saying. Well, what's wrong with that? The church is concerned about poverty, war. There's a large basket of concerns for the Catholic Church, and why shouldn't Catholic voters say, well, I'll take those 2 out of 3. I can't find any candidate who supports them all.
Well, they're all important. They are, and for us to in any way say they're not would be inappropriate. But some issues are more foundational than other issues, and from the Church's perspective, the life issue is the foundational one. There's no way that we can care for poor children unless they're children first, and unless they're born. And so even though the Church is by practice and by theology committed to taking care of all the poor and responding to all the needs that are articulated there is a foundational issue when it comes to abortion.
All right. The Times discusses progressives and conservatives within the church. These are the terms that are used. And it also reports that Senator John McCain, the pro-life Republican candidate in this election, of course, quote, met with Archbishop Charles J. Chaput of Denver, that would be you, shortly before the Democratic convention. Archbishop Chaput has been an outspoken critic of Ms. Pelosi and Mr. Biden, close quote. Does that make you a conservative?
I don't know. I don't know that I'm outspoken critic of either one of those two people. I simply spoke to the people of our church, telling them that what they said wasn't accurate. And I guess I could be described as an outspoken critic of them, but that wasn't the intention. The intention was to make sure that the faith of the church is clearly understood by our people.
All right. Segment 2, what Vatican II hath wrought. You spend time in this marvelous book, Render unto Caesar, arguing that the Second Vatican Council, which took place in the early 1960s, was one of the great graces of God to the Catholic Church in our time.
The primary grace of God to the Catholic Church in the 20th century. Really.
Ooh, all right, you're firming it up. Let me, here's from an article called Party Faithful, recent article by Peter Boyer in the New Yorker magazine. Quote, now, he's characterizing what happened. Let me just see if you agree with this one paragraph characterization. The Second Vatican Council convened in Rome in 1962. By the time the council concluded 4 years later, the Church had a radically transformed understanding of itself. The progressive, there's that word again, the progressive wing of the Church felt that Vatican II was a liberation and invoked its spirit in challenging the faith's core doctrines and theology. This contingent, the progressive contingent, eventually came to dominate much of the institutional Church, holding sway particularly in the Catholic Academy, close quote. Broadly accurate?
I think broadly accurate, except I would say that the Church came out of the Second Vatican Council deeply refreshed, not broadly new. We returned to our sources. It was going back to the earliest days of the Church and the earliest days of the Church's self-understanding, and to articulate that in a contemporary way so that the people of our time could live the apostolic faith of the Church in a contemporary way.
All right. Now I offer a defense of the council, paraphrasing you, and you tightened it up. You strengthened that defense. Listen to a few statistics. Catholic seminarians in 1965, 49,000. By 2002, the most recent date for which I was able to find numbers, Googling around on the internet, 2002, fewer than 5,000. Nuns in 1965, 180,000. By 2002, only 75,000, average age of 68. Students in parochial schools in 1965. I'm using 1965 because that's the year the council ends. And
legitimate.
Right. Students in parochial schools in 1965, 4.5 million. Today, even though the population of Catholics is much bigger, only 2 million. You write in Render unto Caesar that the greatest danger for American Catholics is undue assimilation into American life. The question would be, why shouldn't American Catholics assimilate? Or what is to prevent them from assimilating when the Church, after Vatican II, collapsed from under their very feet?
Well, I don't know if I would say the Church collapsed. We've had huge difficulties in the last 30 years of the Church, in the Western world especially. There's no doubt about that. But, you know, as you mentioned those statistics about nuns and priests and seminarians, I thought of the statistics about active laity. And in the Archdiocese of Denver today, the freshest groups in terms of the new evangelization are led by laity and completely led by the laity, which wasn't the case 30 years ago. Really, 30 years ago, people generally sat in the pew and listened to what the priest said, and the church was identified with the priests and the sisters. Today, the church is, and this is the way the church has always really understood itself, is primarily the laity, and those of us who are clergy are there to serve the laity. And to see the new efforts at evangelization that are being led by the laity shows me the fruit and grace of the Second Vatican Council.
Okay.
But nonetheless, assimilation is a big issue. And the issue we were talking about earlier about public officials' position on abortion shows that although we claim
Catholic public officials, right.
Yes, we claim that this is the age of the educated laity, it demonstrates that that isn't always the case. People think they're educated and they're not. But I think the Church has done a very poor job in passing on the authentic apostolic faith to its people. And we need to get better about that, and we need to get better very, very soon.
All right. Let me take another shot at you, Archbishop, as a bishop. The Church teaching on this is very clear. A bishop doesn't represent the Pope. He doesn't represent the National Council of Bishops. In his own diocese, a bishop is the representative of Christ himself. No higher moral authority than that. But listen to a bill of particulars. 1981, Pope John Paul II denounces, quote, easy and hurried marriage annulments, which in that year in this country numbered 43,000, up from about 400 before the Second Council. And by the year of John Paul II's death, have the American bishops listened to him? Well, the number of annulments has gone up to some 50,000. 1983, the bishops issued their pastoral letter on nuclear weapons, which is very difficult to read as anything other than a sharp criticism of the Reagan administration, which is even then pursuing a policy which 6 years later will lead to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the liberation of tens of millions. In 1984, the bishops issue their letter on the economy, which again is very difficult to read as anything other than a criticism of the Reagan administration, which was issuing policies that would lead to the longest peacetime expansion in American history. And beginning in 2002, you get the emergence of these sex scandals, some 14,000 victims by the Church's own count. Wrong on the Cold War, wrong on the economy, tainted by sex scandals, and if American bishops won't listen to the Pope, why should American Catholics listen to them? Where is the grounding for the moral authority?
You know, if we could take each one of those issues separately, I'd be able to respond. It's kind of overwhelming.
I'm doing a whole dump truck
that's
full.
Fine.
Go right ahead.
But how do I respond to it as a whole? I don't know. Certainly the bishops have made many mistakes. We've sometimes spoken authoritatively on things we know little about. We ought to be very careful about doing that. In terms of the sexual abuse, the bishops admit that they've made many mistakes. And we need to do nothing about that except apologize and apologize again and again. But nonetheless, despite all those problems, I think the faith of the Church has been preached clearly by many bishops, and I see new signs of growth and life in the Church throughout our country. And so I think, for example, let's go back to the question of annulments.
Right.
The reason why there's so many annulments today is because lay people who are married don't give very good examples of fidelity in marriage to their children. And the next generation has a clear commitment to the fidelity that's required in a marriage relationship. So to blame that somehow on the bishops is inappropriate. I mean, I think there are fewer Catholic marriages that are valid today than there were 30 or 40 years ago, because people don't enter the marriage with the intention of being faithful. And for the Church to acknowledge that in its marriage courts is not a sign that the marriage courts are corrupt. it's a sign maybe that we're not giving a good example of married life within the context of our family, which is the most important part of the church.
All right. Here's the sort of the underlying question, in my mind anyway. And I recognize I just dumped a lot of stuff on the table there. But the question is, well, here, St. Patrick's Cathedral this past spring, Pope Benedict XVI called for a new spring for the Church of America. And you've several times in this conversation said that you see signs of renewal. So I guess what I'm groping toward here is you, as one of the leading clerics in the church in the United States, do you have the sense, I can only put it crudely, is the church turning a corner? Do you see a new generation of priests and laity? Do you see the new spring that Benedict is calling for?
I don't know. I mean, I do see a new spring because I believe the church is always being called to a conversion and to new life. Whether it's going to take place in the way we want it to take place, or whether it's going to take place in the context of a real collapse, I don't know. It's God's plan, and I'm happy to participate in it as best I can. But I don't know how to predict that. But I do know that Jesus rose from the dead, and that his power is present in the church through the power of the Holy Spirit. And there are many people in the church today who are enlivened by that and are responding to that. So I have confidence that the church will survive, and more than that, the church will be vital. But whether or not it'll be structurally strong in the sense that it was in the 1950s, I don't know.
You don't know.
I don't know.
Right. Matthew 22:15-21. I'd like to take you to your book here. Let me read this passage that you quote. Then the Pharisees went and took counsel how to entangle him in his talk. And they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians, saying, Teacher, we know that you are true, and teach the way of God truthfully, and care for no man, for you do not regard the position of men. Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, Why put me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the money for the tax. And they brought him a coin. And Jesus said to them, Whose likeness and inscription is this? They said, Caesar's. Then he said to them, Render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. You write that Jesus does three vital things here. First, he acknowledges, I'm quoting from the book, first he acknowledges that Caesar has rights. Would you explain that?
Well, it does. In other places in the Scriptures, we're told we have a duty to obey legitimate authority in a community, and certainly Caesar, representing the political power, has a responsibility for the common good of the community, and we, as members of that community, have a responsibility to contribute to the common good. So we have responsibilities to Caesar.
Right. Second of the three items here, Jesus, and again I'm quoting from the book, Jesus desacralizes, in effect he demotes Caesar.
Right.
Explain that.
Well, at the time when Jesus was asked that question, there was a sense in the Roman Empire that Caesar shared in divinity and somehow was given the respect that we think belongs only to God. In Jesus' comments, he demoted Caesar and said that God is God and Caesar's not. And that's very important for us to understand today. You know, the Christian proclamation Jesus Christ is Lord is a political statement in a sense, because it says that no one else is Lord. You know, the President of the United States is not Lord, the King of the Kingdom is not Lord, but Jesus is Lord. And that's desacralization of political power.
And third, you write, quoting from your book, Jesus stays silent about what exactly belongs to either Caesar or God. Would you explain that one again?
Well, I think that means we're invited to make those decisions in our life, and that's why the involvement of Christians in the political life of a country is very important, because that's our process of working out what belongs to God and what belongs to Caesar. Of course, for those of us who are Christians, everything belongs to God. Even what belongs to Caesar ultimately belongs to God. But we have a duty to understand our responsibilities as citizens and to participate in the common life of the country.
All right. Now, there are fundamentally two narratives about the relationship between the church and state. One holds that Christianity, the church itself, informed the development of all the highest political attainments of our civilization, the freedom and sacredness of the individual, separation of church and state. In its first 3 centuries, the church defined itself in opposition to the Roman Empire and so forth. But the other narrative, which I will call the Christopher Hitchens narrative, says that during the Renaissance, and especially during the Enlightenment, Europe won its beliefs in human rights and equality and tolerance and so forth by struggling against the church. That the church is this is a kind of retrograde, and our highest achievements, in fact, come in opposition to the church. Now, I know where you stand on that question, because in Render Unto Caesar, you're eloquent on the first narrative. But for someone who's listening, how would you refute the Hitchens thesis?
Well, I think we have to acknowledge what's true in the Hitchens perspective, that there have been times when the church has too closely identified itself with the state, and because of that has done a disservice to itself and to the Christian message. But at the same time, I think if we read history honestly, we see that the best of who we are today in the Western world has its origin in the Jewish and Christian understandings of human dignity and our responsibility for one another for the common good. And I think that kind of hostility that you see
Right.
on the part of the pop atheists, that are so popular today, it's pretty easy to refute historically. It's very entertaining, but I don't think it's particularly damaging, because I don't know who really takes them seriously. I think a much more worrisome thing is a kind of pressure we feel from the elites of our culture to be quiet about our faith, and that's a practical atheism. It's not a theoretical atheism, but it's one that requires us to act as though God doesn't exist, and we have to resist that.
And how do you, as an archbishop, how does that impinge on your life? How do you feel this pressure, and how do you see it in the life of your people in Denver?
An example is one you gave today when you showed that New York Times article. I mean, it always characterizes those of us who are speaking to our own communities about what we believe as somehow interfering in the political life of our country, or interfering in government, and we're scolding people rather than talking about the truth. The elites, so many of the elites of our country, are hostile towards the church having a voice. And that's not very broad-minded. It seems like if you believe that everyone has a right to speak his or her mind, that includes the church, and we ought to have a place in the public square to do that.
Don't you want to smack them around a little bit, Archbishop? You seem so placid and serene. Don't you want to?
Well, I don't know that smacking people around does any good.
All right.
But I have to say sometimes I would be moved towards anger by some of the things that are said, but anger doesn't accomplish very much except motivate you to do something more. St. Augustine said that hope has two beautiful daughters. One of them is anger, and the other is courage. If you have hope that things can be different, you get angry at the way things are, and courage is necessary to make sure they change. And so I think anger can be a good motive for moving into the future in a stronger and fresh kind of way.
All right. The foundational right, as you describe it. Again, I'm quoting from Render Unto Caesar. Quote, "The logic behind abortion makes all human rights politically contingent." Close quote. Explain that.
Well, if we can decide, whether we meaning government or a small group of people can decide when someone has human rights, that means we can draw that line at different stages in human history, and that makes all of our rights contingent. I mean, who gives anyone the right to decide that an unborn child has no right to life? And we don't. I mean, the governments, whoever is making those decisions, takes that authority on itself or on himself. And if we allow that to happen, if we give someone the authority to make that decision, they can make the decision in a way that affects us very negatively later in our life. So I think it's in our self-interest to oppose abortion, because I'm 64 years old, I'm getting older. If they can cut life off at a certain point back there, they can cut it off at a certain point beyond which.
Now you're very so. I see the argument in principle. That is to say, if arbitrariness about life itself is permitted to the political system, then the arbitrariness could in principle begin to show up other places. But you make a much stronger argument than that. And here you talk about modern day Europe and euthanasia, loss of civilizational morale, and so forth. Would it be your argument that unless the right to abortion is consistently challenged, that there would be in practice there would be a drift toward euthanasia and so on?
Well, I think there is a coarsening.
That's going on already.
There is a coarsening of the value of human life in the Western world. And it shows itself, as you just said, in the desire on the part of people today to encourage euthanasia, to make assisted suicide a legal thing. It's happening in our country. It certainly has happened in the Netherlands and in Scandinavia. So I think that if we don't consider human life sacred from the moment of conception through natural death, people will begin to decide what's useful and what's not, or who's useful and who's not, and it makes all our human rights contingent, and it's very, very dangerous.
Quote, again from Render unto Caesar, quoting you, my friends often ask me if Catholics in genuinely good conscience can vote for pro-choice candidates. The answer is, I couldn't. I know of nothing that can morally offset that kind of evil, close quote. Now, there's a historical component even to your own position as I make it out. 1980, for the first time, one political party includes a pro-life plank in its platform. It's the Republican Party, and Ronald Reagan runs the first explicitly pro-life candidacy in American history. It hadn't been an issue before 1973. And he explains that the abortion liberalization law that he signed as governor he views as a mistake and regrets it. And in 1980, his opponent is Jimmy Carter, who's pro-choice. And you supported?
I supported Jimmy Carter.
All right. So something has changed in those years.
Well, yes, because in those days I took the position that many people take today, that abortion's a very important issue, but one among many. Probably can't do much about it now, but we will as time goes on. And so let's vote for what's possible. I've changed my mind because I see that my position was not correct. It was wrong, because we've had, since that time, how many years have passed since then?
Well,
about 30 years.
Right.
And since then, we've had growing numbers of abortion. There's been no change at all in terms of the party platforms. And I think that unless we stand up and courageously say we've got to do something now, we're admitting that abortion is going to be the way of life in our country into the indefinite future. I don't think that's true. I think we have to fight it. We have to do all we can to make sure that our country understands that this is the foundational issue for the health of our society, the health of our culture.
Now, in an interview with the New York Times, I guess this goes back a couple of years.
4 years ago.
4 years ago.
David Kirkpatrick, the same fellow who wrote the article today.
And you said, excuse me, I think a lot of Catholics thought that after the initial phase of abortion on demand, we would back away from abortion. But every time we try to begin to limit partial birth abortion legislation, which would limit abortions, the court disembowels it. Every time. Close quote. Now that actually does sound angry. My question is, back during the 1980s, when the bishops seemed to be devoting their attention to nuclear and the economy, and I don't remember bishops speaking anything like as forcefully as you have spoken, and again and again and again in recent years now, on abortion. Furthermore, if one reads the John Jay report, the Jay Center report on the sex scandals, the huge majority of them took place in the 60s and 70s. They became public much later, but they took place in the 60s and 70s, some into the early 80s. Right. And so the question I have here is, what is happening in the church? Do you see your brother bishops going back, so to speak, to first principles, or are you, Charles Chaput, an anomaly?
Well, I don't know. I don't know how to make those kind of comparisons, but I do know this. I lived through the 60s. I was ordained a priest in 1970. It was a time of great confusion. The sexual revolution was taking place, and all these concerns about the economy and about war and Vietnam.
And the council was being worked through.
And so it was a time of confusion. And I think one of the things that the Catholic Church wanted to do during the council, a legitimate thing, was to show a friendlier face to the world so that we could attract people to Christ through our openness and our fraternal love. I think that then became confused with a certain kind of tolerance of the evils around us, and we backed off, saying very clearly where the church stood on issues like life. It didn't work. I mean, the church opened its windows to the world. The world closed its doors to the church. It wasn't a mutual kind of self-giving or whatever. So I think we have to be realistic. Our approach to handling this did not work. the best way to handle something that doesn't work is to change what you're doing. And I think that it's time for the church to change its tactics. The goal has always been the same: to protect unborn human life, all of human life, protect human dignity from the moment of conception through death. And we have to do it in ways that work. And what we did before didn't work.
All right. And I'm going to try one more time. I recognize that you're actually not interested in big historical trends. You're interested in doing your duty. That sounds to me like what you're trying to say.
I don't know. I don't know that I can. I don't know how to interpret those historical. I don't know if we can. That we're a bit away from it.
When you go to a meeting of the
bishops,
of your brother bishops,
right.
What's the council called? It has a formal title.
Yeah.
The National
United States Conference of Catholic Bishops.
All right. So everybody's there. And when you go to a meeting, do you get slapped on the back by your brother bishops and saying, Charles, right on?
A few, but not too many.
All right.
I think that there are differences among the bishops on how we should handle this. I think if you invest your energy in your life in going a certain direction for many years, it's difficult sometimes to admit that's not the direction to go. It's hard to say it doesn't work. But I think a sign of maturity is a willingness to admit you made a mistake and to try a different tactic. And I think that we need to grow into a mature understanding of what we have done or haven't done and how it's worked or hasn't worked.
All right. Our final segment, the present moment. Here, August 24th, Speaker Pelosi makes her statement on Meet the Press, misrepresenting the church's teaching on abortion. You have a statement out the very next day. The Conference of Bishops follows you by a day and produces a statement. And
well, that they have to be more careful than I am.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to suggest that
But they were speaking for the body of bishops,
right.
and I was speaking for
they have to pass it
myself.
around to more committees or
well,
more people.
They do.
Right.
They do.
Right. So, but the point is, she speaks, and the bishops find their voice and speak back. And then on August 29th, John McCain names Sarah Palin, who has given birth just 4 months earlier to a Down syndrome child. And a couple of days later, we learned that her oldest daughter is pregnant out of wedlock and is going to keep the baby. And so the question is, would you like to, the question is, does that represent the best 2 weeks for the pro-life movement since 1973 and Roe versus Wade? Do you have the feeling something is it?
Well, I think it's a wonderful example that the Palin family's given in both those cases you talked about. And that's the way people I know always act, quite honestly. The Catholics who are faithful to what the Church teaches always give birth to Down syndrome children.
But it's only 10% of Down syndrome pregnancies now end in birth.
I know. It's because we have this practice of doing these medical tests before people are born, and we can discard them because the law of the land allows us to do that, and that's a huge violation of human dignity. And it's a violation of our capacity to love people who are in difficult circumstances. I think it's a wonderful example. But I know many people like that. And it seems to me that the people who are the best people are the ones who've suffered because they love their family in difficult circumstances. And I hate to see it be so antiseptic and clean that people don't have those opportunities to love in difficult circumstances.
All right. She's a Republican. At the Democratic Convention, which was held in your city, and to which you were not invited, there were 4 sessions.
Well, I was invited, but I wasn't invited to pray. But they invited me to come and sit and watch. But
you were not invited to give an invocation?
No.
All right. But can you point to hopeful signs in the Democratic Party? I don't know if you supported Carter, you said, in 76 and 1980. I don't know if you consider yourself a Democrat still, but
I've never been a Democrat or a Republican.
Really?
I've always been an independent. But I thought Jimmy Carter showed, he articulated the scriptures and showed a path towards hope, I thought. That's why I supported him.
All right.
I don't know. I don't know what to say. It seems to me that the abortion plank of the Democrat Party is even more strongly embraced in the latest platform than it was before. They insist that this is the irremovable position of their party. And I think it's unfortunate. It seems to me that Catholics in the Democrat Party, and there's lots of them, lots of good Catholics, I hope, in that party, they should really force their party to drop that platform plank, to change it. They have an obligation, if they're going to be Democrats, to do what they can to change things. As Republicans have an obligation, Republican Catholics have an obligation to do what they can to make sure that the platform of the Republican Party respects human dignity and the common good.
All right. Now, This is a total flyer of a question. It's not related to historical trends or church teaching. It occurred to me, and I thought if I have a chance to ask you, I'm going to ask you. What I've noticed, what's been commented on, mostly in blogs, the mainstream press hasn't picked it up too much, as best I can tell. But at campaign stop after campaign stop, at Sarah Palin's campaign stops, people who have Down syndrome or autistic children or other special needs children are turning up with these children. And it seems to me, I'm putting this crudely, you've probably thought about it more deeply than I'm sure you have, that there's a way in which there's an astonishing moment taking place in the political system right now whereby these people, as I said, the statistics are 90% of Down syndrome pregnancies end in abortion. Right. So these 10% are on the margin culturally. The culture does nothing to support them or celebrate them. Right. They make silent sacrifices every day.
They're embarrassed because the culture looks down on them for having these children.
And suddenly this political figure, simply by her presence, validates them.
Not only that, but validates having 5 children.
It validates having 5 children. As a father of 5, I'm happy to hear that validation. But here's the bit, so she validates the sacrifices of, to put it crudely, the 10%. But the other 90%, the political system can validate, but it cannot grant or extend forgiveness. How, do you see what I'm at there? The people, I remember in the White House in the old days when I was a speechwriter, one of the arguments against mentioning the pro-life position in speeches by President Reagan was that so many millions of people had had abortions, and you don't want to remind them of this horrible experience.
We're told the same thing in terms of preaching in church.
Oh, really?
Yes. Whenever I preach about abortion or even about divorce, I often have people come after me after Mass and criticize me for saying anything about it because they've either had an abortion or they're from a broken family. Somehow we're supposed to make everybody happy by not speaking the truth, and I think that's very unfortunate.
But you're in a position of being able to extend forgiveness.
Well, we all are. I mean,
right.
I can't formally.
So the question I'm trying to ask is, how does the society, if we follow the Chaput program and reassert the fundamental moral principles here, you've got tens of millions of people. How do you move toward healing? I hate that.
In terms of those
for the society. Yeah.
Well, I think getting back to
in other words, excuse me, I want to just, you've been saying that the Catholic position on abortion is not distinctively Catholic, that it ought to be an American position.
Right.
So the question is, you as a bishop can extend sacramental forgiveness, people can go to confession, and there's a certain sense in which that is a profound closure or healing. But that's not available to the wider society.
No, but in terms of, we can study our Constitution. We can go back and historically understand what the founders meant by what they gave us. It's a great gift. I think our Constitution is something for us to be very, very, very proud of. And it does embody the right to life, and it should be interpreted in that clear, distinct way and not in the vague definitions that is sometimes has been given to us by the Supreme Court. So I think our Constitution can become a common document that leads to healing if we take it seriously.
I see. All right. 3 final questions. And if you can just give me a couple of sentences or a tight little paragraph, if that's possible. Somewhere watching this interview, there's a patriotic American who's an atheist, just can't bring himself to become a believer. What is an atheist to make of an archbishop?
I don't know. But we're both American citizens. We both love our Constitution. We see the history of our country as a history of great opportunity for believers and non-believers alike. Why would we ever move in the direction of pushing any group out of the public square? I think non-believers who are committed to human dignity and the common good have every bit as much right to stand in that square and talk as I do. And we're brothers and sisters in a common cause.
All right. Here's somewhere, let's posit, there's someone watching, a young man who had thought about becoming a priest but may have been put off by the scandals that began to emerge in 2002, or a young woman who was thinking about becoming a nun and just says, oh, there's just too much confusion, there's too much taint of scandal. What would you say to such a person?
I think that the young woman ought to go visit a convent where there are young women who become nuns and The gentleman ought to go to a seminary and see that there are many young men who have the same horror of what happened, but have a love for the church and are going to make sure by their own lives that it doesn't happen again. I mean, it's the real human beings who have embraced the call to be sisters and brothers that should be the greatest source of encouragement for those young people.
You have 2 seminaries in the Archdiocese of Denver, as I recall. How are your numbers?
Our numbers are terrific. We have 115 students studying there this year, and we have somewhere between 75 and 80 studying to be priests for the Archdiocese of Denver right now.
All right. And last question. We're out of time. What 2 sentences would you like to speak to the next President of the United States?
I'd just like to have the opportunity to speak to him, regardless of who it is, because I think that it's important for the President of the United States to be partners with the religious leaders of our various faith communities. And so I would hope that there would be an openness to dialogue and to listen, because the Church has a long history of caring for human beings, a long history of working for the common good and protecting human dignity. And so I think we have something to offer. We want to be partners in the process of making our country the great kind of country that the founders wanted us to be.
Most Reverend Charles J. Chaput, Order of Friars Minor, Archbishop of Denver, and the author of Render Unto Caesar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
At the Hoover Institution, I'm Peter Robinson. For Uncommon Knowledge, thanks for joining us.